Picture this, a silent morning in medieval Europe. The sun rises over quiet cobblestone streets, but the air feels heavy, unnaturally still. A faint cough echoes, then another, followed by a scream. Within hours, the town is a graveyard. Families lock themselves inside, priests refuse last rites, and doctors flee. What they don't yet know is that this invisible terror will soon sweep across continents, turning the world into a nightmare of death, despair, and fear. In the 14th century, humanity faced one of the darkest chapters in its history. The Black Plague, also known as the bubonic plague, struck Europe with unimaginable force between 1347 and 1351. It wasn't the first epidemic, but it was the deadliest, claiming the lives of over 200 million people across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Entire villages vanished, economies collapsed. Faith itself trembled as people wondered whether God had abandoned them. The disease, carried by fleas on rats, travelled silently through ships and trade routes, turning prosperity into horror overnight. The plague didn't just kill, it reshaped civilization, rewriting the way humans lived, worked, and believed. What began as a whisper in the East would become the loudest scream of human suffering the world had ever known. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. It started with whispers carried by the wind, faint rumors drifting along the trade routes that connected the East and the West. Merchants spoke of a strange sickness in distant lands, a fever that killed in days, a darkness that clung to the air long after the dead were buried, but no one truly believed it until it was too late. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of 12 Genoese trading ships arrived at the Sicily and port of Messina. The people of the town rushed eagerly to the harbour, expecting silk, spices, and news of faraway lands. Instead, they found a nightmare waiting for them. The sailors who staggered from those ships were already half dead, faces swollen, skin covered in black sores, blood dripping from their mouths. Within hours, the docks filled with the sound of coughing, wailing, and desperate prayers. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, and nothing would ever be the same again. The disease spread with terrifying speed, moving silently through rats and fleas that infested every street, every home, every ship. No city was safe. Within months, the once bustling ports of Italy turned into charnel houses. The same trade routes that had brought prosperity now carried death across the continent. People watched helplessly as their families fell one by one. Fathers buried their children in shallow graves. Mothers whispered prayers over lifeless infants, their tears staining the earth. And still, the infection spread. It did not discriminate between rich and poor, between saint and sinner. The Pope himself fled Rome, hiding behind fires meant to purify the air. In Paris, scholars gathered to debate the cause. Was it bad air, a punishment from God, or a conjunction of the planets? But while they argued, the dead piled higher in the streets. There was no answer, only fear. Imagine walking through your city and seeing nothing but smoke from funeral pyres rising into a sky that seemed to have lost its colour. The bells that once rang for weddings and festivals now tolled endlessly for the dead. People learned to count time not by days, but by the number of bodies they carried to the pits. Entire neighbourhoods vanished overnight. The plague took hold not just of the body, but of the mind. Fear became its own disease. Neighbours turned on neighbours, believing that strangers, ignorers, or the poor were spreading the sickness. In some places, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and entire communities were massacred in blind hysteria. Humanity was crumbling under its own terror. Doctors, powerless and ignorant, became grim symbols of the age. They wore long black robes coated in wax and strange bird-like masks filled with herbs, hoping the fragrant air would protect them from the miasma of death. Their glass-covered eyes gave them the look of creatures from another world. But behind those masks were terrified men, helpless as they watched every remedy fail. The infected developed painful swellings, buboes, under their arms and between their legs. Their flesh darkened. Blood vessels burst beneath their skin, and they bled from the nose and mouth until death came as a mercy. Some died in a single night, others lingered in agony for days, shunned by everyone they loved. The church tried to keep faith alive, but even priests refused to administer last rites when their congregations dropped dead around them. Graveyards overflowed. The air itself seemed poisoned. "Bring out your dead," the collectors cried as they pushed carts through the empty streets, their voices echoing through silent towns. They came for bodies stacked in doorways, for children left in cradles beside their mothers, for husbands and wives locked together in death. It was said that even the dogs wept, their mournful howls haunting the nights. No one dared to touch another. Handshakes, hugs, even shared meals became acts of suicide. The markets closed, the fields went untended, and ships rotted in harbours. Trade, law, and trust collapsed. In England, 1/3 of the population perished. In Italy, cities like Florence lost half their people in a single year. Chroniclers wrote that the living could not bury the dead fast enough and that survivors grew too numb to mourn. A man might see his wife die in the morning and be dead himself before nightfall. And yet, amid the terror, strange acts of courage still flickered. Some priests stayed to comfort the dying. No, it would cost them their lives. Some mothers refused to abandon their sick children. Others risked everything to bury strangers with dignity. These were the forgotten heroes of the plague, their names lost but their compassion undimmed. Still, for every act of love, there were 10 of cruelty. Looters robbed plague houses, doctors demanded gold to even look at a patient, servants fled their masters, and families sealed themselves inside homes, leaving the sick to die outside their doors. The social fabric of medieval Europe tore apart thread by thread until only raw survival remained. Imagine standing in that silence, watching the last light of civilization flicker under the weight of death, knowing that the world you once knew had ended, and the new one might never come. By 1348, the Black Death had become unstoppable. It spread across France, Germany, and Spain, devouring entire regions like fire racing through dry fields. Cities that had stood for centuries fell within weeks. The disease traveled in ways no one understood, through breath, touch, even the clothes of the dead. Families fled to the countryside, believing open air could save them, but they only carried the infection farther. Villages locked their gates, travelers were shot on sight, fear turned the human heart to stone. In some towns, people gathered in churches to beg for mercy, only for the congregation to die where they knelt. Others turned to wild indulgence, feasting and sinning as if the world would end tomorrow. In a way, it already had. The plague did not just kill bodies, it murdered belief itself. Faith cracked under the strain of so much death. People asked how a loving God could allow such suffering. When prayers went unanswered, they turned to superstition, to witchcraft, to the cults of the flagellants, fanatics who whipped themselves in the streets, hoping their pain would appease divine wrath. They chanted hymns soaked in blood, their songs echoing through the darkened towns, as if trying to drown out the screams of the dying. In the chaos, the old order of the world collapsed. Feudal lords who once ruled with iron fists now found their lands empty. The poor who survived demanded wages and rights they had never known before. The economy twisted, reshaping itself in the plague's shadow. And somewhere in this ruin, a strange rebirth began to stir. The very horror that nearly ended humanity forced it to evolve. Art, medicine, and thought would one day rise from these ashes. But in the moment, all anyone could see was darkness. Imagine living in that silence, where every cough felt like a death sentence, where you slept beside your loved ones knowing they might not wake. The fear was endless, yet the human instinct to endure somehow survived. Survivors emerged from their hiding places to find the world unrecognizable, fields overgrown, cities half empty, silence where laughter once lived. They buried the last of the dead and began to rebuild, haunted by ghosts they could never forget. Out of the plague came new questions about life, death, and what it meant to be human. For centuries afterward, stories of the Black Death lingered in art, in memory, in nightmares. The skeletons of the Danse Macabre danced with kings and peasants alike, mocking the illusion of power. The lesson was cruel but clear: death spares no one. Modern science would later reveal that a tiny bacterium, Yersinia pestis, caused this apocalypse, carried by fleas on rats. A truth so simple it would have saved millions, if only they had known. Even today, outbreaks occur in corners of the world, reminders that the plague never truly died. It waits in silence, patient and ancient. But now we have knowledge, medicine, and history to guide us. Still, the shadow of 1347 lingers, a whisper in our collective memory of how fragile civilization can be. Imagine, just for a moment, standing in a medieval street as the bells toll once more, feeling the same dread, the same helplessness that those long-dead souls felt. The story of the Black Plague is not just history, it is a mirror held to our own time. For all our science and progress, one invisible enemy could still bring the world to its knees, and perhaps that is why we must remember, not to fear the past, but to learn from it. For the greatest danger is not the plague itself, but forgetting what it taught us, that humanity's strength lies not in conquest or wealth, but in compassion, resilience, and the fragile courage to survive when everything around us turns to dust. By the time the plague had finished its grim march through Europe, the world that remained was unrecognizable. Survivors wandered through silent cities, stepping over bones bleached by time and sun. The once proud cathedrals stood empty, their stained glass windows shattered, their bells rusted in place. The air carried a strange, heavy stillness, like the world itself was holding its breath after too much grief. The survivors could hardly believe they were alive. They whispered to each other that perhaps the end of days had passed, and they were the ones left behind to rebuild what had been lost. But rebuilding was not simple. The very foundations of medieval life, faith, family, and order, had been shaken to the core. No king, no priest, no doctor had been able to stop the plague. And so for the first time, ordinary people began to question everything. Why had God chosen them to live while others perished? Why had he allowed such horror to unfold at all? In this silence of divine absence, a strange transformation began to take root. The fear that had destroyed so much now gave birth to curiosity, to a hunger for understanding. Out of the ashes of despair, the first sparks of modern thought began to glow faintly. People started to look, to reason, to medicine, to science, seeking answers not from heaven, but from the world itself. In Florence, chroniclers like Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of the plague's madness, preserving the stories of those who had lived and died through it. His words painted a haunting portrait of humanity stripped bare, how nobles fled to the countryside, how servants looted their masters' homes, how love itself became a memory. He described how the young and the healthy danced and drank among the graves, trying to forget the smell of rot that hung over their city. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer would later capture that same uneasy world, a world where laughter was nervous, where death sat at every table. But perhaps the most profound change was invisible. The plague had shattered the rigid social order that had ruled Europe for centuries. With so many dead, labour became scarce. The peasants, once bound to their lords by chains of poverty, suddenly found their work valuable. They demanded wages, and for the first time they were heard. In the decades that followed, revolts erupted across Europe. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the uprisings in France and Italy, all fueled by this new awareness that power could shift, that even the lowest born could rise from the ruin. The Black Plague, in its cruelty, had unintentionally loosened the grip of feudalism and planted the seeds of freedom. Yet, freedom came with haunting memories. The survivors could not forget the sight of carts filled with corpses, the cries of children calling for parents who would never return, the eerie glow of funeral fires lighting the night sky. Even when the fields turned green again, the shadow of death lingered. Every gust of wind carried the faint reminder of that invisible enemy. In monasteries and universities, scholars pored over ancient texts, desperate to find meaning. The writings of Aristotle, Galen, and Avicenna were re-examined, tested against the terrible reality they had lived through. Some people got to turn in the born, eager to doubt old beliefs. Others turned their despair into creation. Artists painted skeletal figures waltzing with the living, the famous dance of death, reminding everyone that no rank or wealth could shield one from fate. It was art as both warning and comfort, a way to give form to the fear that words could not express. And in that art, something extraordinary began to happen. Hope. The very act of painting, writing, and remembering became defiance against the silence the plague had imposed. To remember was to resist oblivion. It was as if the survivors were saying, "We are still here. We will not be forgotten." But survival had a price. The generations that came after carried the trauma like a scar passed through blood. Every cough, every fever became a reminder of the past. When later plagues struck in smaller waves, the London outbreak of 1665, the Marseille plague of 1720, people reacted with the same ancient terror because memory, once burned into the human heart, never truly fades. The Black Death had carved its mark not only on flesh and cities, but on the collective soul of humanity. Imagine for a moment being one of those survivors. You step outside your small wooden house. The streets are empty. The silence feels alive, heavy, watching you. You see weeds growing between the stones where once children played. The church tower stands against the horizon, but no bells ring. You remember the faces of your neighbours, your friends, your family, and realise you are the only one left. The grief is unbearable, yet there is something else beneath it, the faint spark of gratitude that you still breathe. You begin to gather food from abandoned houses, to till the soil, to feed the few who remain. Slowly, a rhythm returns to life. People start to trade again, to rebuild homes, to speak of the future, but their laughter sounds different now, softer, more fragile, as if each breath might be their last. The Black Death had taught humanity its most brutal lesson, that life is never guaranteed. The survivors' children grew up hearing the stories, their lullabies mixed with warnings. Wash your hands, burn the infected clothes, do not forget what happened. Centuries before the discovery of germs, instinct and memory became humanity's first defense. In a strange way, the horror of the plague prepared future generations to fight unseen enemies. It made them cautious, watchful, resilient. And yet, as the decades passed, people began to mythologize what they could not understand. The plague became both villain and teacher. Some saw it as divine wrath, others as nature's vengeance for human greed. It shaped religion, art, and even politics. The Church's authority, once unquestionable, had been shaken when prayers failed to stop the dying. This doubt would one day ignite revolutions of thought, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, all traced, in part, to the disillusionment born during those dark years. The plague had forced humanity to confront its fragility and, paradoxically, its strength. When the Renaissance bloomed in Italy, with its art, science, and philosophy celebrating human potential, it did so under the long shadow of the Black Death. Every masterpiece of that era, the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci, the architecture of Brunelleschi, the writings of Machiavelli, carried within them the echo of mortality, the awareness that beauty exists only because death does. The plague had stripped the world to its bones, and from those bones, humanity built something astonishing. But the echoes of that time have never fully faded, even now when disease sweeps across nations, when fear spreads faster than truth, we repeat the same ancient behaviors. We blame, we panic, we isolate, and we hope. The Black Death taught us that panic kills as surely as plague, that compassion is often the last line between order and chaos. Modern medicine has given us tools those medieval doctors could never dream of: microscopes, vaccines, antibiotics. But beneath it all, the same trembling heartbeats, the same fragile trust binds us together. The lesson of the plague was never truly about rats or fleas or bacteria. It was about humanity's response to suffering. It was about how easily civilization can fracture and how much strength it takes to piece it back together. When the plague ended, it did not vanish. It transformed. It became memory, an ancient whisper in every hospital corridor, every emergency ward, every frightened crowd. It lives in our collective instinct to prepare for disaster, to build systems of protection, to care for one another when fear tempts us to run. The world that rose after 1350 was scarred but wiser. Cities built better sanitation systems, ships were inspected before docking, governments established quarantines. The very word born from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, the period ships were held before passengers could disembark. The foundations of public health, of modern medicine, trace their roots directly to that era of unimaginable death. Out of chaos came order, out of despair, understanding. Humanity had looked into the abyss and stepped back, not unscathed, but changed. Centuries later, scientists uncovered the truth. Under their microscopes, they saw the tiny bacillus that had caused the apocalypse, Yersinia pestis, a fragile organism invisible to the eye, yet powerful enough to unmake empires. With that discovery came awe and humility. How could something so small destroy something as vast as civilization? The answer was as old as humanity itself, because fear, ignorance, and arrogance do the rest. The plague did not just kill millions, it exposed how quickly we crumble when faced with the unknown. But it also showed how far we can rise. Every vaccine, every act of compassion in times of crisis, every hand that reaches to help the sick, all of it is born from the memory of those who endured the Black Death. They are the silent teachers of history, their suffering transformed into wisdom that guides us even now. So when you hear of pandemics today, when fear spreads faster than facts, remember them. Remember the streets of Messina, the fires of Florence, the silence of London. Remember how the world ended once, and how it began again, not through kings or miracles, but through ordinary people who refused to give up. The Black Plague may have nearly ended humanity, but it also revealed what humanity truly is: fragile, fearful, yet infinitely capable of surviving the darkness, and yet, out of all this darkness, humanity endured. The Black Plague reshaped the world, forcing people to question faith, power, and even the meaning of life itself. Out of death came new medicine, new thinking, and a fierce determination to survive. The empty streets eventually filled again, children were born, and the world, scarred but alive, continued to turn. Maybe that's what makes human history so hauntingly beautiful, our ability to rise after every fall, even when surrounded by shadows. The plague almost ended humanity, but it also revealed its most powerful truth, that no matter how deep the night, dawn will always come. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what kind of dark historical tales you'd like to hear next. Your support helps us keep history's forgotten voices alive, one story at a time.